Imagine no possessions, John Lennon sang, from a 72-room English mansion with a Rolls-Royce in the driveway, a white grand piano that cost more than most people's homes, a private lake in the garden, staff, groundskeepers, a recording studio built into the estate. He wasn't being a hypocrite. He was doing something far more dangerous than that. He was telling you the truth about himself and daring you to notice. Imagine is the most played song in the history of the Olympics opening ceremonies. It has been performed at the funerals of presidents, broadcast from space, sung by children in 47 languages. It is the unofficial anthem of peace, of hope, of human unity, and almost everything you believe about it is wrong. The song was not written from a place of peace. It was written by a man in crisis, a man in therapy so intense it made him scream into pillows until he lost his voice, a man fighting the United States government, grieving the loss of his closest friendship, and living inside a marriage that the world watched but never truly understood. Imagine did not come from enlightenment. It came from desperation. And once you know the real story of where it came from, you will never hear it the same way again. To understand Imagine, you have to understand 171. The Beatles were over, legally, officially, irreversibly over. The lawsuits were multiplying, the lawyers were talking, and the four men who had changed music forever were no longer speaking to each other, except through newspapers and song lyrics. John Lennon was living in England at Tittenhurst Park, a Georgian mansion in Ascot that he had purchased in 1969. 72 rooms, 33 acres of private grounds, a garden so vast it had its own folly, a small ornamental tower built purely for aesthetic reasons, a man who would soon ask the world to imagine no possessions. But inside those 72 rooms, John Lennon was not comfortable. He was not at peace. He was not the serene, enlightened prophet that the world wanted him to be. He was in pain. Beginning in late 1970, John had entered into primal scream therapy with psychologist Arthur Janoff. The therapy was radical, even by the standards of the era. The idea was simple and brutal. Go back to the original wound, back to the moment in childhood when something broke, and scream it out. Scream until the body remembers what the mind has tried to forget. For John Lennon, that wound was not hard to find. His father had abandoned him when he was 5 years old. His mother had given him to an aunt to raise. And then, just as he had found her again, just as Julia Lennon had become real to him, she was hit by a car and killed. John was 17. Janoff's therapy cracked John Lennon open. He described it later as the most terrifying and the most freeing experience of his life. He stopped sleeping. He lost weight. He wrote compulsively, furiously, pages and pages of raw feeling. The result was the Plastic Ono Band album, the most brutally honest music John Lennon ever made. Songs like Mother, where he screamed, "Mama, don't go, Daddy, come home," over and over until his voice broke. Songs that made listeners feel they were intruding on something private, something that should not have been recorded at all. And then, almost immediately after, he wrote Imagine, not as a conclusion to that pain, as an escape from it. But here's what changes everything. John Lennon did not write Imagine alone. The woman who sat next to him at that white piano, the woman whose ideas were in every single verse, didn't receive a songwriting credit for 25 years. Her name was Yoko Ono, and the reason she wasn't credited tells you everything about who John Lennon really was. In 1964, Yoko Ono published a small book of conceptual art called Grapefruit. It is not a book in the conventional sense. It is a collection of instructions, imaginative, poetic, sometimes absurd prompts for the reader's mind. One of them reads, "Imagine the sky, feel it, touch it, become it." Another, "Imagine a cloud dripping. Dig a hole in your garden to put them in." Imagine, imagine, imagine. When John Lennon read Grapefruit for the first time, he was thunderstruck. He carried the book with him. He gave copies to friends, he said publicly, that it was one of the most important things he had ever read. And when he sat down to write Imagine, he was, consciously or not, building directly on Yoko's framework, the structure of the song, the invitation to the listener to mentally construct a better world. The repetition of a single word is an act of will. All of it traces directly back to Yoko Ono's artistic method. John knew this. Years later, in a 1980 interview, just months before his death, he finally said it out loud. The song Imagine, the lyric and the concept, came from Yoko. It should be credited as a Lennon-Ono song. A lot of it, the lyric and the concept, came from Yoko. But those days I was a bit more selfish, a bit more macho, and I omitted her contribution. A bit selfish, a bit macho. For 25 years, he omitted her contribution. It was not until 2017, 37 years after John's death, that Yoko Ono was officially added as co-writer of Imagine by the National Music Publishers Association. The song that the world called John Lennon's masterpiece was, in large part, Yoko Ono's vision, and the man who sang Imagine No Possessions couldn't bring himself to share the credit. In 1971, John Lennon gave an interview to journalist Red Mole, a radical left-wing publication, and said something that has been quietly buried ever since. He said, "Imagine is virtually the Communist Manifesto, but because it's sugar-coated, it's accepted." He said that himself. He was not embarrassed. He was not apologetic. He was explaining the trick. Because Imagine is, at its ideological core, a radical song. Strip away the piano and the soft voice and the white room and the flowers, and what you have is a systematic dismantling of the structures that organize Western society. No heaven, no hell, no religion, no countries, no borders, nothing to kill or die for, no possessions, no greed, no hunger. These are not gentle suggestions. These are not vague hopes. These are, if you listen carefully, direct challenges to capitalism, nationalism, and organized religion, the three pillars of the world John Lennon's audience had been raised to believe in. And yet, nobody heard it that way, because John wrapped it in the softest possible sound: piano, gentle voice, major key, a melody so open and simple it feels like something you already knew. He had learned something from the Beatles years. He had learned that the delivery changes everything, that if you want to say something radical, you say it beautifully, and people will sing it back to you without ever understanding what they're agreeing to. It's sugar-coated, he said, and because it's sugar-coated, it's accepted. John Lennon smuggled a manifesto into the world's most beloved peace anthem, and it worked perfectly. But the deepest irony, the one that John himself seemed both tortured by and amused by, wasn't the politics. It was the mansion. Because the man asking you to imagine no possessions was sitting in one of the most expensive private estates in England, and he knew exactly how that looked. Tittenhurst Park had a music room. John had it designed specifically to record Imagine. The walls were white, the floors were white, the grand piano, a Steinway Model Z, was painted white. White curtains hung over tall Georgian windows that let in pale English morning light. The concept was deliberate. John and Yoko had been developing their white period aesthetic, an artistic philosophy that used whiteness to suggest emptiness, openness, infinite possibility. The White Room was not just a setting, it was a statement. A statement filmed inside a 72-room mansion worth several £1 million. Filmmaker Jonas Mekas was brought in to document the recording. What his cameras captured became one of the most iconic images in music history. John Lennon, in round glasses and a loose white shirt, sitting at a white piano, while Yoko moves quietly through the frame, opening the curtains, letting in the light. It looks like a dream, and in many ways, it was one. Because the reality of John Lennon's life in 1971 was considerably messier than those white walls suggested. The Apple Corps lawsuits were bleeding money. Alan Klein, the manager John had insisted on over Paul's objections, was under investigation for fraud. The U.S. government, under Richard Nixon, had begun deportation proceedings against John, citing a 1968 marijuana conviction in England. FBI files, later released under the Freedom of Information Act, revealed that the government was actively monitoring his movements, his phone calls, his associations. John Lennon, the man singing about imagining no countries, was being surveilled by one. He was also, and this is rarely discussed, still navigating the emotional wreckage of primal scream therapy. The work with Arthur Janov had opened things in him that hadn't closed back up. He was volatile. He was raw. He was swinging between moments of genuine clarity and periods of deep, frightening darkness. And every morning, he sat down at that white piano in that white room, and played the song about the world he wished existed, not the world he lived in, the world he couldn't quite reach. Here's the question nobody asks about Imagine. If John Lennon didn't believe the world could actually be that way, if he knew better than anyone the gap between the dream and the reality, then why did he write it? The answer is the most human thing about him. John Lennon was not naive. He was one of the sharpest, most sardonic minds in the history of popular music. The man who wrote Working Class Hero, a psalm that begins with the line, "As soon as you're born, they make you feel small," was not under any illusions about the nature of power or suffering or human cruelty. He knew the world was not going to imagine its way out of inequality. He knew that a piano song was not going to stop wars. He was not that innocent. So why imagine? In 1980, just weeks before he was killed, John sat down for a long interview with journalist David Sheff. It became one of the most comprehensive interviews he ever gave, a detailed, honest accounting of his life and his work. And in that interview, he talked about Imagine with a clarity he had never quite managed before. He said, "Imagine" was a sincere statement, not just a revolutionary song. It's a prayer, really. I'm not religious, but it's a prayer. A prayer, not a manifesto, not a strategy, not a political platform. A prayer from a man who did not believe in God, but who needed desperately to believe in something. Because 1971 was the year that John Lennon's world had been reduced to its most essential components. No Beatles, no Brian Epstein, no Maharishi phase, no bed-ins that felt innocent and hopeful. The playfulness of the 60s was over. The casualties were visible everywhere. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Brian Jones, friends gone, dreams cracked. And John was a man who had never learned how to sit with hopelessness. His entire life had been a refusal to accept things as they were. As a child abandoned by both parents, he had survived by imagining a different version of himself, tougher, funnier, better. As a teenager with a guitar in Liverpool, he had imagined stadiums. As a Beatle, he had imagined changing the world. Imagination was not a luxury for John Lennon. It was how he survived. And so, in the White Room, in the mansion, in the middle of the wreckage of everything he had built and lost, he sat down and wrote the purest version of what he had always done. He imagined, not because he thought it would work, because not imagining was the one thing he could not do. Imagine was released in October 1971. It reached #1 in the United Kingdom and #3 in the United States. The critical response was curious. Some praised it as visionary. Others, particularly conservative critics, found it dangerously naive, even subversive. The BBC, which had banned several Beatles songs over the years, played it without incident, perhaps because, just as John had predicted, the sugarcoating worked. Over the following decade, the song took on a life entirely separate from John's intentions. It became the thing you played when something terrible happened, after assassinations, after natural disasters, after acts of terrorism, after school shootings, after plane crashes, at Olympic ceremonies, celebrating the unity of nations, which John had specifically asked listeners to imagine dissolving. The anthem of a world without borders, played at the most nationally competitive event on Earth. John was alive for much of this transformation, and his feelings about it were complicated. He was proud of the song. He would perform it live, sometimes at political rallies, sometimes at quiet benefit concerts, and each time the audience would sway and sing along, and the moment would feel genuinely communal, genuinely hopeful. But he was also aware of the gap between what the song asked for and what the world was doing, the gap between the White Room and the reality outside it. In one of his last interviews, he was asked whether he thought Imagine had actually changed anything. He paused for a long time before answering. "I don't know," he said, "but I think it's important to keep putting the idea out there. Even if nothing changes immediately, you plant seeds. You plant seeds and you don't always see them grow." He was shot 4 months later. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was killed outside his apartment building in New York City. Within hours, people had gathered at the Dakota, the building where he lived, and begun singing. They sang Imagine. Of course they did. Because that is what the song had become. Not just a piece of music, a reflex, A human reflex toward the idea that things could be different, should be different, might one day be different. And maybe that was exactly what John had intended, not to change the world with a single song, but to give people a place to put their hope when the world felt like too much. A 3-minute prayer for the irreligious, a vision of something better, offered without conditions, without doctrine, without a church or a flag or a set of rules. Just a man at a white grand piano, in a room that cost more than it should, singing about a world he didn't live in, but couldn't stop believing in. Years after John's death, Paul McCartney was asked what he thought of Imagine. He said, "It's a great song, a great, great song, and it's very John. It's hopeful and it's angry at the same time," which is exactly what he was. Hopeful and angry at the same time. That is the truest thing anyone has ever said about John Lennon, and it is the truest thing about Imagine. The man who wrote it was not at peace. He was not enlightened. He was not free. He was a human being, sitting in an imperfect life, trying to describe a perfect world, which is, when you think about it, exactly what we all do when we're brave enough to imagine. If this story changed how you hear Imagine, share it, pass it on, because some songs deserve to be understood, not just sung.